All right. Let me just, so let me just broadcast this real quick here.
Well, I'm gonna reach out.
Let me know when you see it.
Let me see. Nothing yet.
Okay. So did you, okay, did you give me the authority to share?
I
Okay,
did.
yeah,
Let me try it again. Okay. Yeah, I did.
okay, good. Hold on.
A couple of people said that they're forced. That's more than me.
So, and then I have a bunch of random shirts and jerseys, which I will at various stages bring out or maybe put on or whatever, just for fun. All right, so let me, give me a second here. That's weird. That. Let me know when you see kind of the slide deck as a whole screen.
We see like parts. Oh, here we go. Now it's good.
Let me just get rid of this real quick. Hide floating. Okay. So what I wanted to do is just present out sort of a history chronology wise, and then sort of interspersed play a like after every 3-4 World Cups, just go and sort of play some of the historical film that captures it at various stages, especially the early period, because obviously after World War II, or really in the late 50s, there became obviously a lot more material that way, and then basically 66 was sort of the TV World Cup, right? That changed basically everything. So just so you know, I'm going to kind of go through that. And my background is in the U.S. I've been a level 3 ref, 3, 4, 5, various stages. The last roughly 10, 15 years, I have my B license. I've from both organizations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on U.S. Really, I'm not going to spend much time at all on U.S. football structure. I mean, if we want to, that we could carve that out as a separate animal. Most people just don't understand a lot of things, practical things, like we have antitrust laws in the United States. That's why you have so much fragmentation in football, and and you don't have that obviously in other countries, or they basically have written a exception so that's not a problem. So I'm not going to really go into the weeds. If you guys want to, at some point here, I can carve that out and spend 5-10 minutes to sort of explain it. Most people aren't very satisfied with it, but it's just sort of the reality of it. And that's not going to change because we haven't added an exemption since hockey in 76, maybe 75. That's the last exemption for sports we've had in the United States. So all of the historical sports have been grandfathered in through antitrust exemptions. So anyways, but so that's my background. I've coached youth, all the way up to U16, U18, girls, and then and boys also up to like U14s. And then refed all the way up through college and lower USL. Basically, my license allows me to go to or used to allow me to go to USL 2 before they were owned by MLS teams. So that used to be sort of fourth, almost fifth division. Now that's sort of a mess, but yeah, so that's sort of my background. Any questions on that and kind of the approach? And I can adjust too. Don't worry. Like we can, if it bores you too much to get into sort of the history process and you just want to get into sort of random, let's have fun and talk football, then we could do that too. I mean, there's no rules here. I just was sort of, wanted to kind of because there's all kinds of people come from all kinds of different perspectives. I mean, there's all kinds of people who have watched a lot of football, but maybe don't know all the history. There's people who, really don't know a lot about it, except just, sort of what happens every 4 years. And there's people who, this is like the first, second, or third most important thing in their life. Anyways, any questions? And just jump in. I mean, please, I don't want this to be just sort of a weird lecture on the history of FIFA. That's pretty boring. But anything else, or?
No, Star, we'll just get into it.
Okay. So, forms of football, soccer, and just so you guys know, a lot of people don't know this either, but the creation of the word soccer was not an American creation. It was an English creation, actually. The English restructured the language in the late 1920s around football. They wanted it to be, because England's pretty class-based system society then. And so football was sort of like the dirty, ugly sport. Rugby was sort of the elite sport, amongst, gentlemen. And so they attempted to restructure the language. And so in England, they started calling it soccer. That happened to be in the 1920s and into the 1930s, exactly the same time it started to take off here in the United States, especially in the East Coast. For those of you that are here in the East Coast, basically Boston through Baltimore, basically. They used to call it the B2B corridor because you had so many, immigrants from all parts of Europe that had already been playing, and as part of World War I, played quite a bit, behind the lines. That the people that came to the United States started to just became sort of this foundation of players. And we actually had some, I'd say pretty strong leagues at that point, extremely competitive, actually. And that was when we shifted to that terminology from football to soccer. And then when the problem is once the English stopped using the word soccer, which is pretty much 1937, 38, Americans wanted to switch back to football. Problem is American football had already taken off. And so this is sort of like a weird little thing around language history. And you can just look it up on Wikipedia. I mean, it's been there for years. I mean, I always kind of remind people in England whenever I go there, or English friends, of this, and they have no idea. But anyway, so just wanted to put that out there, because outside of the normal soccer jokes and football, soccer, and I would just say, well, blame the English, and then most people don't know what I'm talking about. So now you do. And when you read about it, it's just one more weird thing. And that's part of what's fun about the sport, is it's got a lot of weird history, politics, people, culture, etc. So obviously human beings have been kicking things for an enormous part of our history, going back, I'm sure, thousands to tens of thousands of years. I'm sure we organized ourselves at various stages, in the last 5,000 years, almost everywhere on the planet, whether it's the Eurasian steppes, whether it's Mesoamerica, whether it's anywhere, basically across Western Eurasia and any plains. I'm sure also in Africa and the Arabian area, wherever you had an animal's head or a set of material you could roll up, or both, that you could bind in glues, or you could tie. People kick things. They played versions of polo. There's one type of sport where you sort of whack the ball, and then you jump off and play, and then come back on a horse, right? It's sort of funky. So anyways, that's early stuff. And then, most people sort of accept the fact that basically, the English, let's say formalized it. That's probably, or at least the documentation of the formalization. That's basically the greatest strength we have. And that formalization then, went across various parts of Europe, especially Southern Europe. And as people migrated during colonialism into South America, it obviously spread, especially in southern South America, Argentina, Brazil, or southern and eastern South America. Brazil, Argentina, it became Uruguay. Chile was sort of a weird line that because it just was very unpopulated for a very long time. So it eventually obviously crossed, and the Chileans and Vidal, one of my favorite box-to-box midfielders the last 10 years, guys like people like that, obviously developed. But, like anything before there's something big and formal that works, almost like the United Nations, right? There was the League of Nations, and there was these other sort of League of Powers, going back, 100, 200 years before UN, or the creation of the UN. You had these very, kind of fit and start attempts. And a lot of it came down to the world really hadn't, for the most part, formalized sporting itself, the concept of sport. You had, basically the creation of sports commissions to regulate it. You had a lot of non-regulated stuff like boxing, early sort of bat sports. I mean, really rugby was kind of one of the few that was extremely formalized in the 19th century. And then football, basically, really, to be honest, football was really a working man's sort of evolution of rugby. It was sort of an easier, it's sort of a lower barrier to entry. You just really needed a ball, and the rules were substantially easier. I mean, I still to this day, I'm not obviously native to any of the great rugby nations, even though the U.S. has become a pretty good sevens country, and especially in the Olympics. But I'm still learning rugby. I mean, it's just so foreign if you weren't born in, England, France, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, all the great powers. And so, and a lot of it is it feels complicated, and compared to football, it just isn't. And so you could see how that sort of, evolution took off as a working man's game. And of course, it just exploded in England, across big swaths of Southern Europe, with, the newly independent Greeks, obviously the Italians, especially as the Italians were moving from, papal states into really a nation. Football in many ways sort of became a common approach. There's these old games that Italians used to play, and football sort of really just replaced that at the end of the 19th century. It was sort of, in some ways, almost modern, right? It just felt modern. So we'll go into sort of FIFA, which most people don't realize it was sort of the French and the Swiss that sort of brought this formality together. And a lot of it comes down to the French weren't really that good, and the Swiss weren't at all. So they could act as, in some ways, these sort of very independent arbiters, especially in the beginning. Whereas, once the French really were more of a rugby country early on, especially in French elite society. It sort of matched to the English elite society, really, in a lot of ways. So it wasn't until much later that the French became really a football country, or evolved a football country. And a lot of it had to do with, it was a working person's game, and it was a poor person's game. And then when you had the end of French colonialism, especially southern France, I mean, it just was an explosion, of, the whole southern French region, Marseille, and not just Marseille, but, Marseille sort of the Jerusalem of French football for the last, 60 years. And, and to this day, right? I mean, when you have OM, when Olympique Marseille plays, PSG, or the original rivals like Lyon, you have, it's massive. I've been to, the French Classique in just going to OM is just an amazing stadium. It's kind of like it's the other Barcelona without all the Barcelona success, basically. And people would argue that, I understand. But for those of you that don't know, it's the largest governing body, sporting association. It's actually the largest. It's basically the largest non-governmental governing body. So outside of the United Nations, which really is a federation of confederate organizations. So FIFA is an integrated organization, and we'll get into sort of, if you want, the regionality of it. So basically, there's regions that, in theory and in practice, basically submit to FIFA rules. And a great example of this is sort of my referee's license versus a coaching license. So a coaching license can be defined nationally, and good or bad. But referees' licenses are extremely regulated. So basically, your lower levels, your 7, 8, 9 license, which is the entry level, which are pretty much a day or two for a 9, 3 days for an 8, 2.5 days. 7 is like 3.5, 4 days, and then when you go from there, it's sort of the leap, and that's when you can start to do national matches. Was part of sort of secondary leagues, and that's pretty standard everywhere. And then once you get to 1 or 2 or 3, you join the FIFA system, basically. So when you have a level 3 license, you switch to basically being a national and a FIFA ref at that point. So, qualifying matches you can do, and not necessarily men's or women's finals qualifiers, but it could be the under 19s. It could be, the under 17s World Cups. It could be all the other sort of World Cups that there are. And the Confederation tournaments that you have, which is really this feeder system. So, this was sort of interesting. The Great Britain, which is the UK now, really had its own sort of tournament, and to this day, it's one of the arguably gaps that very few people really talk about, is just the fact that you don't have an integrated football inside the United Kingdom, right? So you have different, subnational really, which obviously contributes to them being, suboptimal. I mean, if Gareth Bale, was a big box, number 10, that could have created some challenges for some clubs the last 8 years or 10 years, or some nations the last 8 to 10 years. So I mean, you have so this history is tied to the political history, and that's one thing you see over and over again with football, is football just mirrors really the political history that you have, and in conflicts even. You'll have conflicts that are these just on fire between countries, and when football is played, some challenging things can happen. Nowadays in the modern world, we're pretty good at preventing that, either playing in empty stadiums, pushing the match to some other place, or controlling the population that can even attend. So you basically make it a neutral match. I mean, that's pretty much the standard now. Nobody wants sort of these, football war 1969, kind of matches where, thousands of people can be killed, and, you basically start a civil war over a football match. So what's really interesting about FIFA is it really started at the beginning of the Great Depression. And so, as basically the world's economy, collapsed somewhere between 25 and 75% all over the world, this started. I mean, it's just bad luck. So really in the 30s, and this is something that's it's kind of interesting. So football, where it was significant before, was in the Olympics. Really, the Olympics were the sort of signature sporting event in society. And so the Olympic football, which, is really not too different than today. I mean, today we've sort of packaged it as a under 23, 24 world. And it wasn't really that then, but it was close. And you had a world of sort of big nations competing in a very, very sort of whoever could show up tournament. I mean, it was really that simple. And FIFA was really, it was pretty novel to think that they could really take on the behemoth of what the Olympics were. And a big part of it was people, basically business people, started recognizing that there was a commercialization opportunity. I mean, not by today's standards, but by those standards in the early 30s. So, which of course the Olympics were amateur, and any professionalization was viewed as, evil, basically. Of course, you could afford that if you were part of the elite gentry, or the sort of semi-professional athlete that had wealth, which either many were sponsored like that, or they had it, and so they could be these sort of semi-professionals and keep their amateurism. But that wasn't really a people's game at that point, because it was pretty hard to do something for 10 or 20 years and, not have any income. And the rules back then were truly extreme in terms of income. I mean, we should do this sometime on Jim Thorpe. I mean, he really got screwed. The history of Jim Thorpe, who, by today's standards would just be a swimmer's, deal that they do every month. But he basically, and many others, lost all of their privileges to compete in the Olympics, and lost medals, and in some ways people attempted to almost disgrace them. It was almost like there was a morality play around it, and so there was really this huge gap for basically regular people to enjoy a regular people's sport, and and that was really kind of what FIFA was really attempting to sort of, put together. And the original, president at the time, Jules Rimet, wanted it to be more than just sort of an Olympic sport. He wanted it to be this competitive sport, he was really a visionary. In some ways, the only sports like this were either, intense seasonal sports like baseball, which was pretty well established at that point. And then these sort of off and on leagues that weren't incredibly consistent. And then you had the Olympics. And what he wanted is something that had the same feeling of the Olympics, the same magnitude and scale, but that there would be this sort of continuous play through, either qualifying tournaments or regional, sort of open matches, and that could really seed the sport. So, I mean, it really was pretty visionary to think that you could take this game and you could, do what he did with it, or, what they did with it. So let me go here. So today we're at this point in today's talk, we'll talk just about the Men's World Cup, but, if we can do a second one, we can definitely go into the Women's World Cup, which, has really grown pretty dramatically the last 30 years. And, I think it's on the verge of, of substantial growth really in the next 20, 30 years. I mean, I could see it easily becoming, 50% of the World Cups, of the Men's World Cup viewership.
Remember, Aaron, what the president of FIFA said about it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Do you remember what President of FIFA said about the women? In order to make women popular, he was such a sexist human being.
Yeah, I mean, you have people. I mean, these people, they're all gone, obviously, and they're, and so, I mean, you'll have. I mean, that's really generational. It's pretty clear it's generational as you get, the big thing with women's football now is really the year round, the same league structure that you have for men's club football. You now have, a almost peer level, basically in the top club systems. The only clubs remaining, basically like Real Madrid. I mean, there's only a handful of clubs that don't have, women's club. That's sort of a travesty at this point, but, and that's just going to create a fan base that then feeds into, the Confederation cycles, and then ultimately, the World Cup, and you see it, and a lot of it comes down to, in a sort of, at least with the women, in a strange way, the U.S. women are like the Brazilians, really, with men. I mean, there's almost a both in terms of arrogance and expectation, but also just the factory, right? The factory production behind it. But you're seeing, countries, coming really close consistently, and sometimes overtaking, obviously, the U.S. So, to me, that's going to be what's going to change it, right? When you start really, when the U.S., just the same way as happened with, the last 30 to 40 years, when you really got this round robin amongst all the big winning nations, it just changed. Obviously, TV changed that 60, almost, 55 years ago, and the internet the last 25 years. But ultimately, it's competitive, right? People want to see competition. They want to not believe there's an ordained winner. And once you get that knockout level of football going, anything can happen, and and away you go. So a couple things to know, obviously. So this was a struggle. Even they started the tournament right off the bat, and within a couple cycles, you had World War II, which was obviously terrible for far bigger reasons, and 75 million people lost their lives, and but you lost really a generation of players. You lost a generation, or half of a generation, really, or in World Cup, and that's something to understand. So the average great World Cup finals level qualifying player will only play about half their career that they play professionally at a national World Cup level. So meaning, and there's exceptions, obviously, and we kind of know the exceptions because we know their names. But if you're a player that has a 12-year career professionally, typically you only have 4 to 6 years that you'll be in your World Cup sort of key years that you're at your peak, at least from a World Cup standpoint. And a lot of it just comes down to, especially today, the volume of play is just, it's insane. I mean, the amount of matches that a professional plays, that's a World Cup player. I mean, you're basically just grinding people to dust at this point. And so, very few players can play into their 30s. I mean, there are exceptions, and there are smaller nations that will have a top level player. One of my favorite players the last 10, 15 years is Drogba from Ivory Coast. So, you'll have special players like that. But, if Drogba played for France, he wouldn't be playing on the French. He wouldn't be, top of the box, number 10 player, for France at 34, 36. I mean, so, if you're, go ahead. Sorry,
Aaron. So
Yep.
the first World Cup, how many teams participated, and where was it? And then
Yep. No, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into all that. So I just want to give you some of the sort of bigger background, and then we can get sort of into the weeds. So I wanted to kind of just give you the whole structure of it. The amount of people who watch it, it's billions now. And then when you count every time they turn it on to watch something, it's hundreds of billions of sort of views of something. It really sort of, in some ways, takes up what the Olympics used to be, in some ways can be. So today there's 32 teams that compete. It's going to go to 48 and 26 in 2026. That's been a lot of conflict around that. Every time there's been an expansion from the original, 8, which is when it started, to 12 to 16, 24, which stayed at 24 for a very long time, and then 32, then 48. I mean, I sort of argue, if any of you know American college basketball, it sort of starts to mirror that, where you almost have a play-in tournament for everybody. Like if you have and that's where I see this going eventually. It's sort of like college. It really is like college basketball. Like if you don't make your play-in final tournament in your conference in American college basketball, I mean, you aren't even like, you're really a bad team. Like you're below the fourth best team in your own conference, especially if it's a small conference. So you're talking, 100th plus 120th team. I really see that as sort of the evolution. It'll probably get to 64 in the next 20, 30 years, and that's sort of where it finishes. That's going to be really weird at a certain level, because it's going to mean this tournament starts to become a different form of a marathon at that point. I mean, it already can be marathon-like, especially if you're in one of the groups of death, which we'll get into that, what that means for those of you that don't know. Basically just a 14 group of superpowers, and you basically have to survive to get through, and only the top two teams get through, basically. So but if if you get to a 64 team tournament and you're basically playing two sets of groups of death, or three, I mean, it gets pretty weird at a certain point. So a couple things to know in the modern game is, you're basically starting to start your qualification process the year after the World Cup. Those are sort of your baby tournaments, but and you sort of refresh your team, you get rid of the old guys and gals, you start to play in your younger players to see if they're ready, if they're ready to even participate yet. People who've been hurt, get their chance to kind of come back in. And then generally you have a Confederations Cup, which is sort of like your own region's baby World Cup, regional cup. And that's in between the World Cup cycle. So that's after 2 years. So you're really you're starting your qualification of the World Cup, and you're getting ready for that, regional cup. That's in between the World Cup. And then after that tournament, it's just like fire on, getting ready for the World Cup, especially the year before the World Cup. That's when you'll see things really. And of course, this cycle's been weird because of COVID, obviously. So, you're going to have a very weird World Cup next year. But
just in general, it would be in
well, it's going to be a weird World Cup just because of where it is. It's going to be a weird World Cup when it is, because it's, so those of you who don't know, in Qatar, in the desert, it's going to be basically this weird artificial spaces created, where you're trying to reduce obviously the heat intensity. They're doing it off season. So it's not in the normal time frame. And then worse, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think when they switched the time of the year is as bad. This is the thing most people aren't going to be aware of, when they're going to play it. So these are going to be matches played at like midnight, 1 a.m. And the history of sports is because there's always been a reason, because of, weather, or, two teams didn't get in a basketball, so they played the game at 11 o'clock at night, and and stuff like that. Like kind of the old NBA, the old sports teams would do that. Nowadays, they don't do it as much because everyone has charter planes and things like that. But the history of that is it's pretty bad, because human beings who've been up for 23 hours, tend not to be optimal when they do something. So it's going to be a really weird World Cup. And then, of course, you haven't been playing. So I will say this, you're going to have far fewer injuries, because the amount of play players have had is down quite a bit. The amount of matches. Normally, World Cup level players, between their regular club seasons and tournaments that their club team is in, plus the getting ready for World Cup, a lot of them play up to 75 matches. I mean, it's insane, right? They're playing basically twice a week, or almost like 3 times every 2 weeks. And this year they haven't done that. So I think that will be good because you won't have as many players run down. The flip side is some of them are just going to not be very good because they're just not technically going to be as sharp because they just wouldn't have, they just won't have time on ball as a team. So,
there was another very bad statistics. They said constructing those stadiums in Qatar, 1,200 people had died.
Oh yeah, it's way more than that. I'm sure it's 5,000 or more. And just so most people know this, I mean, if you read about it, it's and this is pretty true around the whole Gulf, is that their version of sort of day laborers and people who do most of the construction. So it's not even, it's almost like through our equivalent of sort of union tradespeople, right? Like it's not just lower end day laborers are basically immigrants from South Asia, whether Nepal, Bangladesh, and they're on these really weird contracts. They keep your passport. I mean, it's a sort of a form of serfdom almost, really, in some ways.
Slavery, cold hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a 21st century version, basically. And I mean, they do get paid, but at the same time, the health and there's no OSHA. Let's put it that way, right? There's not health and safety the way anyone in the normal world would assume health and safety would work. And I don't even mean just the U.S. or Europe or Japan. I just mean places that would that people would strike, basically, if they were treated this way. So we talked all about this stuff, already, just to kind of give you a sense. So there was a lot of funky stuff in the beginning of the World Cup, obviously, because they didn't have a lot of money. It was a depression. So, basically the first host nation, or that was the goal, is the host nations basically paid for everything. And so, but you had the original, almost like primordial football powers in both Europe and in South America. And one thing to note is Uruguay was truly a superpower those first 20 odd years, really 30 years since the early 20s through the fifth. I mean, they kind of didn't get all the due that they sort of deserve in history. A lot of it is just sort of, the modern media just wasn't there. World War II, the origins were still sort of not all put together. But they really were the Brazil before Brazil, really. And a lot of it came down to they just the way they developed the game. They used a lot of, for that era, modern techniques. They didn't quite. Just so those of you, and well, let me take a step back. Does everyone? I assume they do, but if they don't, that's okay. Everyone basically know that there's 10 field players and a goalkeeper, right? So the beginning of football for a long time really was these really weird schemes, right? And so there's this concept called a system of play, which is sort of, just think of it as your schematic of where you put players on the field. And in the early days of football, it was so defensive, which in football language is called negative. So you play positive as you're trying to go forward. You play negative, you're going backwards, or you're trying to absorb, almost like it's exactly like military, really, where you're trying to have defensive action. You're absorbing the contact, and then you're redirecting, and then you're counterattacking. And so almost all of football back then was all negative play. It was just a degree of negative, right? I mean, did you have 8 defenders? Did you have 6? At one point, the Italians had 10. I mean, it was sort of absurd, right? It's you just create layers of defense. And so there really wasn't this offensive mindset that had developed. That came in, and Uruguay was pretty important to that, actually. And a lot of it came down to the type of players they had, in terms of who they were physically, and so they used that to their advantage. So Uruguay hosted the first one. It was their 100th year of independence. There was 13 teams invited, So originally they figured it would be an 8-team World Cup. So they invited, 13. Remet really was really important to try to drag more European teams in. This was one of the advantages that South America had, is that because they didn't have this sort of competing sporting, large scale sporting systems, this became it. Like, this became sort of the Olympics of a sport in South America, and it just exploded in the 30s. And so, so really it was sort of like, you couldn't design a more optimal outcome for a region than what happened in South American football and the beginning of FIFA and the World Cup. So it was a big advantage.
Question, Aaron.
Yep, sure.
Go ahead.
Hi, I just had a question. In the early days, how did the general population accept this? Was this something that was kind of unknown, or was this?
Oh no, it was massive. It was, I mean, some of this, if we're going to be honest about it, is a function of how much cultural production was even available for people, right? I mean, it was, things like museums and sort of cultural activities were just not very available to most regular people in society, and most people were really regular, right? I mean, it was a small middle class, especially Great Depression just starting, so even smaller. So a huge working and underclass kind of population. So, I mean, this spread like wildfire. And really, in some ways, it was the perfect sport at the perfect time in history, in the perfect place, because all you needed was a ball. And what was interesting is there were already ball sports, so the early ball sports, and it was just a question of basically figuring out the air configuration of a leather ball with, because remember, you didn't have plastics yet, you didn't have these other materials, so these were all leather balls, where you didn't have like a heavy medicine ball or anything, but it was a much lighter, almost like a heavier volleyball. And that's just what it became, right? And so every gymnasium, right, every sort of school would get a pile of balls, and that's all they needed. I mean, that's literally all they needed. And I know for a few of you that grew up in other places, I mean, that's probably all you had, and that's all you needed, and those are your probably best memories in your life, because you just, what you did, and you didn't need fancy shoes and fancy nets and all this stuff. You just needed a ball. So this was I mean, it's really like a phenomenon almost, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, or?
It does. Thank you.
Sure. So you had Argentina and Uruguay played in front of 100,000 people. So I mean, it's just insane. And for that era, I mean, it's just crowds like that, which became, and of course, this was an era of radio almost exclusively, and newspapers. You had a little bit of film, obviously it was silent. You might have sort of voiceovers, like, a recorded radio that was sort of like the hack that people had. And they would play them in big cinema, and they would play these, whatever they filmed, they would play them before or after a movie, and people would just sit there and watch this. And so it was really this almost it was like their ESPN really at a certain level, right? And you didn't have a lot of competition with other sports. I mean, there were other sports obviously, but this was different. This was truly supernatural, really, in some ways. So this is what the cup was called. It was actually named for him. So and the first World Cup, Uruguay beat Argentina 4-2. And then this sort of, you could argue this was an important component of creating sort of cultural nationalism in many places, because it gave people something to believe in. It gave them and of course, everything was pretty simple then, right? You had a flag, you basically had a, very early jersey, which was really a golf shirt, so to speak, with your flag on it. And numbers were, very, very limited. Some clubs really didn't play with large numbers in the back of their jersey. No one had names. I mean, that was just not the world we were in yet. And so, it was still pretty simple that way. And obviously newspapers were everything, right? So, the early sort of era of sort of gossip, and sort of, who's up, who's down, who made the team, who didn't, that process really started. And the first generation of these people promoting it, obviously, were just like other promoters in other countries, whether the United States, England, wherever else, when it came to promoting things.
There was an interesting fact about it, Aaron. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yep, go ahead, please.
Yeah, they said that when French beat Mexico, they found out in Paris 4 weeks after they.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
but they didn't know that French beat Mexico 4-1.
Yeah, but it's so you had, because that's one thing to recognize, is just how unintegrated our transmission of media and communications was then. It just wasn't fully developed that way. So you had these lags, but in some ways it didn't matter, because in almost in a certain way, it sort of added to the mystique to these people, right? What I've sort of always argued is that generation, I want to say until pretty much the 50s, they were almost like movie stars, right? There were these other people that you would sort of hear about, and they were sort of special, their lifestyle, just everything, right? And it was, how much of it was true was, probably none of it, but very little. But that didn't matter. I mean, if you hear about what people used to say about Clark Gable or Ava Gardner, Dietrich or whoever, it was that these people were sort of larger than life. And so so what was really interesting is that in the 30s, the business people kind of jumped in and basically wanted to do what business people do, which is to expand something till you run out of anything to expand to. So they just leaped all the way to 32 teams, and they had a qualifying round. It was sort of a mess.
Did Mussolini have anything to do with this?
He didn't have anything to do with that part of the expansion. He was central to, because he was Mussolini, and and the kind of totalitarian state that he constructed, which had a huge cultural component to it, right? So there was a pretty nasty cultural nationalism around it. So it was, I mean, you could argue this was a extremely racist World Cup, let's put it that way, or a nationalistic, you name it. And so what was interesting is, because the success of 30, where very few European teams competed, 34 swung the other way, which really became a European World Cup. And
Uruguay refused to come, right?
Yeah. So, Uruguay came, but the other South American clubs didn't, for a combination of financial reasons. Also, the Italians and the Europeans really, recognized the advantage that the South Americans still had, and they really made it harder for them to compete. I mean, it's just what it was. I mean, there's no way to sort of spin that. So in some ways, they tried to make it more of a Euro with South American characteristics. So you had, with so many players, so many teams, Uruguay didn't qualify for the round of 16. So it basically became a European Cup, which was, Italy and Czechoslovakia. And then obviously the Germans, had some weird protests per Czechoslovakia. I mean, it was a very political, very much almost like the 36 Olympics, right? It had, it got trapped by what was going on in Europe, by the larger politics, basically.
So Sudetenland? That's why Germans.
Well, I mean, that was part of it, but it was sort of, Germany, already had constructed their false, theory of not just greater Germany into Czechoslovakia, but that Czechoslovakia should even be, a country, right? And similar stuff with Austria. I mean, the forces of Germany were clearly already unleashing, and Italy was already unleashed for a decade at that point. So, this one's a very nasty World Cup. It was a nasty one just from the play. It was just a mess. There was just a lot of injuries. I mean, it was just people were playing, like they were playing 3-4 games in a row, like days, so it was just mush really in the end, which contributed to, in some ways, the style of play that evolved in Europe, really, in some ways. And obviously there's Mezia is a legendary player, is a great coach, national team coach. I mean, so there were great moments in this World Cup, and I'm going to play a couple things in a few minutes here. So France 38, which now suffered from some challenges of going into World War II. So clubs like Uruguay, Argentina, Austria, Spain, didn't, compete. So they one thing that changed in 38 is this model of the host nation has an automatic privilege in the final. So that's how far back that goes. And that was some of that came down to France wasn't very good. And some of it came down, or people didn't think they were. And so, no one wanted a World Cup in a country, and then that host country wasn't even playing in it, right? That people even then understood that was probably a marketing disaster. And then also there was a greater commercialization, but once again, they fought all this, the history and politics that was going on. I mean, I think one of the things that regardless of how inept and corrupt modern FIFA has been, and even old FIFA at various stages, there is an endurance that they have, which I really do believe comes out of this era. I mean, they, starting a league a global league in 1930 and somehow surviving through World War II and still putting it together is a pretty remarkable thing, actually.
And what did Germany invade France? 1940, right?
Yeah, 1940. But there was the winds and the clouds of war clearly that were already going on. You had, 38 was Czechoslovakia. Italy was already fighting, all over the place. Japan
was fighting, right? The Civil War.
Yeah, the Spanish Civil War. You had obviously Japan had been fighting for 7 years now. So there was, it was a very, very messy period. So Brazil, was the only team from South America to go to France, and and they had a sort of a phenomenal tournament. They played Italy in 38 in the semis, which is really considered one of the. There's some really great film on, or you can watch it on the FIFA website and on YouTube. It's actually really a pretty amazing match. The they lost by what you would say is a modern mistake that coaches wouldn't make. But I give people, these are things they're figuring out, right? The reason they don't make these mistakes is someone makes the mistake, right? And so, I don't slight mistakes during innovation periods, because that's not fair, right? It's people are figuring these things out. But so France was the first host nation. It didn't win. No one expected them to. What was interesting is, and for any of you that are really remotely interested, teams like Hungary was really a powerhouse team, also very much like Uruguay. And then Sweden eventually became kind of a powerhouse team. And a lot of it came down to sort of their innovation in offense and attacking style relative to that era for really decades. And so, Hungary beat Sweden in the semi, and then went to the to the final. Oh, hold on a second. That's weird. My thing is stuck here. Oh, there it is. Okay. So they beat Hungary 4-2. And they were a two-time champion. And then, you basically had, World War II, which already existed in name, but then it just sort of blew everything up. So, what's amazing is that, basically, FIFA worked, to sort of keep itself independent during the war period, and they hid the trophy. They sort of hid their documents. I mean, they and this is just sort of cultural stuff, right? It's not, we're not talking nation state, because they wanted to, they believed that they could come back and that there would be a world that would want to enjoy football again. And so 50 is a pretty, I think it's one of the more important World Cups. And I know we have someone here from Brazil, so I'm sure he feels the same.
He's about the final.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, I think it's important for lots of reasons, to be honest.
Let's ask him, Luis. What do you know? What do you know about 1950 World Cup?
Well, I was born in 1950.
Okay, great.
Well, I watched this many times, several times on the media.
Sure.
I watched this game, the final game.
What is the name for this date they call it for the final? What do they call it? They call it a dark day, right? Or something.
Yes, dark day, yeah.
Yeah.
Because everyone on the watching the game was certain that Brazil would be the champion.
But it was a Maracanã, right? Maracanã?
Oh, of course.
Maracanã, yes, of course. Maracanã is the biggest stadium in Brazil.
And the world, really.
Yeah. And there are more than, they say 200,000 people in this stadium, but I don't know if it's real. Approximately that amount. But the goalkeeper of Brazil was responsible for the placard, like the victory of Uruguay, because he didn't do the right job. That's what they say. But I don't think in this way. I think that Brazil didn't have the calm, wasn't psychologically prepared to win a World Cup.
Yeah.
And you can see after Aaron is going to tell about the next World Cups, that Brazil took advantage of what happened with the team, and Brazil made many changes, and they start looking at this game, at the final game, with more caution, because they could lose for one goal. They could lose all the work they had done. So I think that this didn't worry me about, because when I was 10 years old, I became more enthusiastic from to watch the cups, like the cups, the World Cups, and the soccer. And one thing in Brazil, since you are born, your father give you a ball and say, go play soccer, go to the street, don't be here bothering everyone here in the house. Go in, play with your friends. So that's a kind of thing that we start playing since we're very young, at the age of 3, 4, 5 years old, you know. And since we had many days with good weather all over the year, we don't have snow in Brazil, so we could train, uh, practice football, soccer all days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Then Brazil became uh, good on the soccer because they had good players. We're gonna discuss the players later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play because I wanted before we get into sort of what I call, the first modern era. And I wanted to play a little video to just go over, which I really think you'll like, especially the early days, because I don't think we really give that early era a lot of love. And so I'm going to play this right now. Just give me a second. And then we're going to jump into the 50s and 60s here. Just give me a second here to get organized. And by the way, guys, you let me know. I mean, is this good? I mean, you like this? Does this flow work for you? Is it too boring? Is it okay? I mean, do you feel like
we discuss as we go, and
Yeah.
the interesting points, hopefully more people get into it. But
Yep. Hold on a second.
this is
There we go.
the background. This is good.
Yeah, good. So I'm going to play this. It's only a couple minutes. It'll bring up to speed, so it'll include. Second. Sorry. You guys see that or no?
Maracanã, yes.
Okay, good. I just want you to. So I'll start this again real quick. It's only a couple minutes, and then these ones in a little while. But I thought that would give you kind of a fun little flavor here, and then I'll get to this. Yeah, so I've got a bunch of these. They're all very short and stuff. So make sure they're not some 40-minute video. There's a lot of, and I own. There's actually this fantastic series. It's all on. It's mostly, I think, on the internet now. It's basically a DVD series that goes. It's like 20 DVDs. It was produced, I want to say, in the mid 90s, maybe. Yeah, it's really great. Which I used to watch that back in the day. All right. So I switched to my Pele t-shirt. Get ready for the era.
And you know what? Pelé, when he played for Cosmos in New York, he recorded one movie. They recorded one movie with him. He was teaching how to kick the ball, how to head the ball. And I got this video, and I put on for my players.
Oh, that's great.
Tyler. Yeah, they love it. And I didn't know that I could get this in the United States, but it's
yeah. So I live in northern New Jersey, and I'm friends with one of the guys that played with him, Escadarian, because he owns 2 soccer stores that are pretty famous here in New Jersey. It's where my kids got all their boots their whole lives, into their 20s even. And and he's great, and he's got all his material from when he played for the Cosmos, and he knows Pele. He's gone back multiple times to Pele's ranch, every 5 or 10 years, because he played with him for 3 or 4 years, maybe 4 years. So one thing about 1950 is that basically it was it was a strange year, right? So it was more of a mini format. A lot of the European clubs didn't come, so there was still this weird dynamic between South America and Europe, which was really the football universe at that point. And you could argue mostly is. I mean, I would say, Africa is really, it's close. I mean, I think there's going to be in the next 20 years a breakthrough, nation in, from Africa that's going to get really far. Whether it wins a World Cup, it's going to do some damage. It's going to knock off a Titan or two, because they're right there. They just have, but so anyways, back then it was really South America and Europe, and they had this weird thing, which in some ways sort of exists still to this day, where it's almost like they don't trust playing where they're going to play. And some of it goes back to, I think, some of the colonial past, but some of it goes back to just sort of almost hyper competitiveness, and sort of the natural mind of a really hyper competitive person often becomes kind of conspiratorial, right? Because you have to lose yourself to become that, that sort of intense. But so anyways, there was a mini league format that was really just a handful of clubs, basically, or a handful of nations that played. So you had, Brazil, Spain, Uruguay, and Sweden that basically went into they basically walked into a semifinal through which was a round robin. And England and Italy didn't participate. So, hold on a second. Sorry about that. That's Carrie. Can you not be so loud? Thanks. Sorry. It's my daughter. So Uruguay won, and obviously a very historically famous match, which there's a couple great movies. There's a really good Pele documentary that's on Netflix. It's really fantastic, and it talks about his childhood, his dad, his uncles, and just the feelings they had, because he was still very young. He was only 8. I want to say he was 8.
10 years old. He was in 58. He was 18 or 17.
Yeah, he was 17.
17.
17. So he was like 9. He was 9. And so anyways, I mean, he remembers just this sort of, this sort of like losing a war kind of a feeling that people had, but also his family and not just him, right? It was a whole generation of players that wanted to be different. And so, what's interesting about football is that a lot of national neuroses sort of flow into the good or the bad of what happens with the national teams, which is sort of absurd at a certain level, because more often than not, there's a bunch of this that has to do with luck. There's a bunch of this that just has to do with your preparation and the kind of stability that you have in your federation and your coaching, your development, your practice, discipline, all that organization. And then just the fact, do these players get along? Do they have chemistry? I mean, it's way more has to do with that than this sort of magical powers that say you can or can't ever win or all that kind of stuff. But when something sort of takes hold of people nationally, people become weird, right? I mean, we see it in everything in life and history.
But you know what? If you watch this video, Pele's video,
yep,
you can assume that Pele was a player who had a big influence in the Brazilian team, because he invited his cousin, I think his cousin, Clodoaldo, to play. So it wasn't the coach who invited Clodoaldo, was Pelé.
No, you're right. I mean, Pele was really, and we'll get into Pele. I don't want to go there yet because he's such a unique figure in the history of football. I argue he really is the Muhammad Ali. He's just a supernatural figure in the history. That doesn't mean he's the best. That doesn't mean, but does anyone say Muhammad Ali's the best? Some do, some don't, but it almost doesn't matter. It's that he's such, it's just such a magnitude figure, right? It's bigger than the sport.
Yeah.
It's a cultural figure, really.
Yeah, yes, exactly. For me, Romario was better making goals, scoring goals than Pelé. Romario, yeah.
No, absolutely, of course, and
him.
But it's almost irrelevant. It almost doesn't matter, right? It's because, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But so anyway, Switzerland. If for anyone that wants to nerd out on this, because either you know about it or you don't, it's really a remarkable World Cup because it's a Swiss World Cup, so it doesn't have a superpower that's behind it as a nation hosting it. So it's a very Swiss Cup, and it's the highest scoring World Cup in history. I mean, they averaged basically 5.5 goals a match, and so it was just scoring. I mean, so this cup, what was interesting about this World Cup is it was not a globally, obviously we weren't yet at that point where you're globally televising everything, but it was sort of the first one where you sort of got closer to real-time information coming out of it, right? People would take the recordings, so they were filming it, they were filming everything really that they could, and they were making copies of it old school style, like you would in the film studios, and they were rushing them to theaters, and so driving them or putting them on a train or flying them in some cases. And so people would listen on the radio to the match all over Europe. And then that night, the next day, 2 days later, they would watch the match in a movie theater. So it was, it was this compression of your involvement, which really made it a big deal, right? And so there wasn't this, I don't know what happened, for 4 weeks kind of thing. It was people knew. And also Europe was really out of the horror of what happened in World War II in terms of its infrastructure. And the sort of cleanup and initial infrastructure rebuilding was sort of already done. And now it's sort of expanding Europe into the more modern social democratic Europe that we kind of know of them in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it just, it sort of teleported the world differently at that point. And so, this was the first time. So this was what was interesting too. We talked earlier. You had, like I said, you had sort of a global event. You had teams now from Africa and Asia. And remember, these are countries now that are newly independent countries, right? Post-colonial. So as colonialism was receding, these countries, started to develop their own national identity. You also had player numbers, and of course, that's the beginning of that's the Nike-ification, right? Before Nike, by 20 plus years, but where you could identify with somebody, you could say, I'm this number, and this number means this, right? There's this identity with it. You started having real qualifying rounds. I mean, this is the World Cup. It starts to look a lot like the modern World Cup and the NCAAs, the college basketball, where all these qualification and the media focus, and working its way to this big set of events in the finals. So the West Germans, who, one thing you have to realize is, obviously coming out of World War II, Germany was split in half between East Germany and West Germany. Germany was not known as a good football country at all. They weren't a terrible one, but they just weren't considered, in a weird way, they were sort of like the United States, really. They were this lots of talent, could do things, maybe, you know, it was just a sort of like always, you know, whatever, not bad, but not good, or great for sure. And they really had a fantastic World Cup. They beat Hungary. Hungary was really at that point becoming a superpower. They were sort of the Dutch before the Dutch. So we'll get into what that means in a little while. You know, they sort of innovated in the way they played football, is what the Hungarians did. The West Germans sort of built their identity in this World Cup, this sort of grinded out, you know, this combination of attacking football, but enough negative football, enough defensive football to not make mistakes, and just basically breaking down the Hungarians and really everybody else, which became a style of play the Germans still have to this day. I mean, I would argue the Germans don't play really that way anymore. We sort of graph on them this idea that that's what it is to be German. The Germans in 2020 are very dynamic players. They play with teams, and the players play all over the world. You know, they play with players from everywhere. I mean, their styles are all, you know, they're like, you know, they're probably as broad as almost any set of players there are in the world now. But back then, you know, and it's sort of a history of this. When you're not bad anymore, but you're not good, you have to figure out a couple things to do really well. Like good goalkeeping, like that's really fundamental. If you don't have that, you have no shot. But so you kind of try to get that right. You try to have a really, really tough back line from a defensive standpoint. So you build that back end like a machine, like a rock. Or the flip side is, if you're explosive, which we'll talk about in a minute with the Brazilians, you try to open the game wide open, and you just catch everybody, you know, in open positions. Oh, it's like any other sport. If you have two people with a ball, a puck, or whatever, and there's only one of them, that's the ideal position to be in. If you're lucky and you could be 3-on-1, yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. In the real world, that's rare. But you're always trying to create these situations where you create 2-on-1s. And the Brazilians were the masters of that. But the Germans sort of figured out an early version of that. So we'll remember the West Germans now later, because they do matter as we evolve in this story. So go ahead. Anyone else that has any sort of questions and
I
stuff?
just wanted to add to it. So this World Cup, the highest scoring player had never been repeated. Fontaine, I think, is 11 goals.
Yep.
Then Puskás, who was playing for Hungary, actually ended up, after Soviet Union reinstilled their forces in Hungary, ended up playing for Spain and played for Real Madrid. And he played with Di Stefano, who was a famous.
Yes, absolutely. Arguably one of the greatest lines in history that doesn't get any credit. I mean, it's a remarkable line. I mean, it's, you know, Di Stefano and Puskás. It's just insane to think of that. It would be like Pele. I mean, it'd be like Messi and Ronaldo today, or Pele and Maradona. They weren't in the same era, but you know, it was just insane, right? I mean, you had but so that's a great point you bring up, in that you had Cold War politics that collided with the World Cups, and the Soviet Union was a weird, the Soviet Union was a weird World Cup or football playing nation, because arguably the greatest goalkeeper in history was a Soviet goalkeeper, the Black Widow, but everything about the Soviets was political, right? And so their players weren't allowed to play in other places. I mean, it was just this, it's very much like hockey, really, in the Cold War. I mean, obviously the Russian hockey players, if they were allowed to play in the NHL, would have, probably transformed hockey into a pretty amazing, much higher watched sport in history, because you would have had
You don't like the fights? You don't like Canadian Canadians breaking each other's faces?
Well, no, that's fine too. But I mean, I'm not. But my point is that you'd have this other power and coming in, and then also, the Czechs were great at it, et cetera. So I think you had. It's almost like the Cold War compressed a lot of the competition because of the limitations that the Eastern Bloc had, and what they could do, who they could compete against, what tournaments they could play in. I mean, everything was political. Like everything was political, right? If anybody that was a NATO country was competing, there's a easily 70% chance that Eastern Bloc country just wouldn't play. And I mean, so, and obviously those Western countries played each other all the time, so they just got better. And the Eastern ones, suffered from that at some level. And Hungary is sort of a sad case, right? Because, Hungary, like Uruguay, was a superpower going back to the beginning of the early era in the 20s and 30s, all the way through to the 50s. And they never really got their due, really, in some ways, because just the sad luck of history, wars, the Soviet, the Cold War, I mean, everything, they just sort of missed that, which is sort of sad, right? I mean, because they're not very meaningful of a football nation anymore. But for a period, they really were. I mean, they were a significant.
Just to give you statistics, European UEFA and Champions League.
Yeah, of course.
The capital of Budapest, capital of Hungary, had fielded from the same city 4 different clubs from that same city, Budapest, in the finals of UEFA and Champions League. The only city that's done ever in anywhere else. It was all 50s.
Yeah, I mean, so you have. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I wanted to ask, because I was wondering, when do private football clubs start? Is it during the 50s?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So I can do, as a future presentation, I could do sort of the let's call it non-national football, right? They call it club and country. So club football versus your country football. So there were private clubs before that and early sort of leagues, but it really sort of became modern and what you would sort of recognize basically in the 50s. And you basically started the goal. I mean, it was pretty clear that football was going to be a European permanent continuous sport, right? Like, and it was just really a question of, could they just organize themselves right, between the different institutions, the national bodies and FIFA, so that they could build a calendar, right? And that sounds easier said than done. Go ahead, try to help your local rec organizations and your town schools build a calendar together. Like, people just don't work together when it comes to building calendars. I mean, you'll just suffer. So it was a big, complicated process, because obviously private owners of football clubs, domestic clubs, as they're called, if they wanted some guarantees around their players playing nationally. And so there became this, a lot of conflict that still exists. Most of it's gone today, but it's still out there. But back then it was pretty, it was pretty real. And also there was a different world in terms of your patriotic responsibility, if that makes any sense, right? The idea that you would be sort of a, kind of a purely economic animal to take advantage of this game, right? For you not to play in one tournament or another, unless you got paid or special, sort of dispensation. That was just, it was a different world then. I mean, the shaming, people just wouldn't do those things. I mean, the few that tried, I mean, they were just, they were just, obliterated in the press and culturally, really, and banned. I mean, so it was still an era that was this, it was almost like there was a professionalization of the club system that was starting, and this sort of super national Olympics was going on at the same time. And it was just trying to sort of get them two to connect, which really, you know, connected in the 60s, where they got much more synchronized. So Sweden 58 is sort of this, you know, it's a very magical moment, I think, in the history of all of modern sports. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in this era, right? I mean, 1959, 1960 is the first live televised American football championship game. So it's Johnny Unitas playing, you know, Bart Starr, Green Bay Packers against Baltimore. So that sort of exploded sport on American TV. Sweden, which we'll go into right now, you had live, you know, superstar boxing, Olympic boxing, plus big time boxing that was getting broadcast. So it was this really shift from radio to television, or blended, right? It was both. It was live radio and television where people could get it, and very early sort of closed circuit, right, to movie theaters. If any of you guys remember those, they still had them in pretty much the 80s. I remember going to some boxing matches in the 80s that you still had that in movie theaters. You know, so you got that really in the late 50s. You know, so what made really Sweden 58, I think, special is that it really was like the Olympics. You had 55 countries that took part. I mean, it was, you know, from all over the world. You had, you know, substantial clubs or countries that didn't qualify: Swiss, Belgium, Uruguay, Spain, Italy, countries like Wales, the Soviets, you know, the USSR, Northern Ireland. You know, so you really had this, you could say, very democratic, you know, super championship of nations over the same sport, same rules. You know, and there was something, I think, pretty unique about this. And then obviously, and so what was really fascinating is, so France, after West Germany, or during the run that West Germany started to go on in the pre-qualifying, France recognized that they really needed to sort of change substantially as a football club, as a nation around football. And that's when the French league started, like the domestic league, and it exploded, because you had French players playing all over in different places. They weren't playing in France because there wasn't really a real league. There were like regional leagues, but they built basically the same modern domestic league you see now, and that, you know, and that's almost always the key in this sport, is if you get a good domestic league going, you're going to probably do pretty well in the World Cup. I'm not saying you're going to win, but I mean, you're going to be competitive. And if you don't have a good domestic league, it's really hard, almost impossible. You're sort of outsourcing your players to other leagues, and, you know, hoping they can gel when they get back together 20 to 40 days a year, which is about all they're together. Back then, that's about all they were together, really. Let's say 30 days a year to get ready and play their tournaments and stuff like that. And except for the World Cup year, then they would be together like 2-3 months. But so you know, France played, you know, fantastically. Fontaine, who's probably, if not the greatest French player ever, you know, right up there. They made it all the way to the semifinals, and Brazil, you know, which obviously, you know, he's not the only reason. He's sort of he's like the tip of the spear, the poster child, Pele of that World Cup. But he also did play remarkably good. And it's so wild to see how young he is there. I mean, he really is a kid. I mean, it's, you know, and he had a fantastic World Cup. You know, he scored 6 goals, 2 two or three of them are just phenomenal goals. I mean, they're modern goals. I mean, they're and I've always believed this. He could play. I mean, that Pele comes today and plays. He could play and be a star today because he had skills that many players today don't have, like the whole style of his play, everything, how he was a two-legged player. I mean, 95% of modern players can't score consistently with both feet. And so this sort of, I mean, he was in the air, and he's not a big guy, and he had most people estimate somewhere between 33 to 38-inch vertical leap. And this is in the old world, right? You didn't have all this performance training and all these sort of, specialists helping you. I mean, it's just, this was, natural, mixed with hard work, mixed with, playing with phenomenal players. And so I kind of spent a little more time here on this. Let me see if I'll put up this.
Just
Yep.
one thing.
Sure.
The photo before of this one shows, Pelé is hopping very high. And
Yes.
And people ask, how come you can go higher than the defense that is higher than you? They are taller than you. He said that's because I trained to go up before, as the ball is coming to the grand area, to the great area.
Yeah.
I go up before the defense. That's why when they are going up, I already stay at the top, so I can head the ball to the goal. So that shows very well, because he wasn't tall. He was maybe 5'6".
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, he's 5'6", but he has a vertical of 3 feet. And more importantly, like you said, his timing, right? His ability to sort of figure out the right moment, to jump, right? So he would really attempt to always catch the other player coming down, and then he would be on his way up, and he would just create that. There's that period where that player can't get down fast enough and jump back up, and he has that advantage. So,
but how did he become a guy going so high? Because he practiced.
Yeah,
he practiced a lot.
And the big thing too, and I think this is a big part of Brazilian greatness at that period, is that the other games, right? So just so that everyone here that might not know, there's the traditional large scale football, which is played on basically a field that's about 15% bigger than an American football field, around there. But in Brazil, in the beginning, especially, now it's France. France does the same thing that Brazil used to do. It's really, I mean, I would argue the French are more Brazilian than the Brazilians are anymore, but that's a different story. I'm not trying to start a war now, but I'm just saying, like, the behaviors now. So the Brazilians used to play street football, which evolved its way into futsal, which futsal is this, think of a football game played with a very small, hard football, like a small ball that's hard, that really can't go too much in the air. And you're playing basically on a basketball court, but you're playing in basically like a hard rubber court now. But back then it would be like on cement, and you would play like with a cage, or, stones around you, whatever. And the other thing the reason that game is really important, you play with small groups, 3 people, 5 people, that's about it, is that you do lots of touches, you do lots of control, you're always, moving your body, you're always manipulating, kind of, it's like the same way as it's exactly like the development of street basketball. It's exactly the same thing. It's all the moves, all the different fakes, all the different games you play with the ball, and sort of how you manipulate people. And then they played another game, which is beach soccer, which changes everything, because, the sand is trapping your legs. So your legs, these guys build, their thighs become tree trunks. I mean, they're just massive. So they have so much power. And to move the ball on sand, because obviously when you kick the ball in sand, if you're going to kick it accurately, you have to kick it flush, right? You can't kick sand and the ball. It's just going to it's just going to be a mess.
Yeah.
So you develop this sort of precision with this. So these two games they would play, and they would play that street and sand 10 times more, maybe 20 times more than they would traditional long field football. Very much like American basketball in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, right? It was street basketball, and then college basketball was your sort of formal basketball. And so by the time you got to the NBA, you were this sort of complete player. And very much the Brazilians had that model, and they had that ahead of everyone in the world by probably 10, maybe 20 years. I would probably say till the 70s. The French today, which if you go to southern France, they play completely on the beach, and they play futsal and indoor, outdoor, and that's all they play. You will once in a while see them play like half-size fields when you're in southern France. They rarely play full field. Except when they're obviously on teams or, in real matches. But when people are on their own personal time, they play this street ball all the time. And every little neighborhood, in France, which is the same thing in Brazil, will have it's like a basketball court that basically people will be playing till midnight or later, if they turn the lights off. And then if you're obviously anywhere hot enough and you have a beach, you'll play on the beach also. And so that's a critical part of the advantage, which of course no one understood this, right? No one understood this, that the Brazilians brought that to the table. So,
so you are saying that the indoor soccer was played first in Brazil, then everywhere in the world?
Oh yeah. No. So first it started as outdoors, but same size, right? There's a Brazilian, I don't know the real name for. Oh, I'm sorry.
I used to play on the streets because there was no cars, so I used to play on my street. Where I was living.
So you have the streets, but then you also have like the basketball court. That's not a basketball court; it's a soccer court, basically, right? Like where it's like on a little hill. Yeah. And you see them all over Brazil. I mean, there's like 100,000. I mean, everywhere has them. And that's where, it's like cement basically, or sometimes grass. And then in the 1970s, early 70s, then the development, and this coincided with the development of both basketball and volleyball inside. So, and you probably know this, like one of the great basketball players in history is Oscar Schmidt. And, he doesn't get a lot of credit, but he's a superstar. I mean, he's basically
Brazilian.
Yeah, he's a Brazilian superstar. So Brazilian. Basketball courts, indoor courts started in the 60s. And of course, as anyone who knows soccer people, the old joke is soccer players are parasites. So if you give them an open space, they're going to take it. And so soccer people would sneak in to the basketball court, especially when it was raining, and then they would play, soccer. And eventually that sort of evolved into these courts, indoor courts being basketball, volleyball, and soccer. And to this day, Brazil is a South American. I mean, Argentina is a great basketball country too. I'd probably say they have better individual players in Argentina, but Brazil will play more consistently better in basketball. But Brazil is a powerhouse in volleyball, men's and women's, and the indoor soccer grew from that relationship with all three sports. And many of those players who are volleyball players or basketball players also play soccer, and the reverse is true, right? Soccer players, football players will play, volleyball or basketball. The other place that this happens, not volleyball, but handball, is in former Yugoslavia, in Croatia, or it used to be Yugoslavia, but in Croatia, Serbia, players will play basketball, they'll play soccer, they'll play handball. And so, yeah, you have that same kind of dynamic, and it all boils down to, if you've got that sort of indoor court, which when it's bad weather, you can just keep playing till midnight, and then you got the outdoor court right outside. It's just, you're just out there doing it, 10 times more than anybody else.
Aaron, you gave me very
Right.
good clues how to coach the people here in America. So I will start coaching them in indoor soccer in some areas with sand.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's typically in the United States, the only places that really do that are Virginia, Florida, and California, that do that consistently. Texas a little bit now, like Southern Texas by Galveston, by the Gulf, and that where you play all three, right? Where you try to do the indoor, the beach, and the regular field. But it's still something that isn't, it's very hard. I mean, New Jersey does it some, but we should do it. I live in New Jersey. We should, I tried to do it for 10 years because there's 300 miles of shore here. And in the summer, it's perfect. But part of the problem is that, people don't value that. And so it's hard to get permit. Everything you need a permit, you need insurance. I mean, it just goes all that BS. And then and then you have kids and parents have to drive them, and it just goes, it turns it into a complicated, impossible thing. And so
is the weather, sometimes it's snowing, you cannot go outside to do
yeah, but so indoors, the winter, in the cold weather places, we do play a lot of indoor soccer in the United States, especially in the East Coast. So we'll play a lot of indoor leagues, that are pretty good, actually. And what makes them really good is international people who are used to playing sort of men's and women's leagues in their old country, and then they play here and they become coaches for for the younger players indoors, especially in the winter. So it's actually the indoor is good here, the outdoor is pretty good. The beach is terrible in terms of we just don't connect with that style of play. And that's a huge advantage. The Brazilians, they've been, they're the greatest beach playing football team in history. The French are basically right behind them. The Spanish are finally catching up, right? The Spanish should have been playing better. Portugal's fantastic, obviously.
I watched some games, Portugal versus Brazil.
Yep.
Yeah. But how come I can become a coach here in America, Aaron?
Well, so it's the same process. You take you basically go to a course. It's like you start with the F license. It's very simple. You could do it in a weekend. It's like I think like $60. And then from that you can coach youth. And then you can take your D license, which is like 2-3 weekends. And then you can start to coach up from there to, the 12, 14 year olds. And then you can, from there, you sort of jump, well, your E and your D licenses, you sort of jump up to be able to coach older kids. And then you can, you don't need anything above your D. You can get your C if you want, but you don't really need it. And that's it, really.
It's not difficult. Yes.
It's not difficult. It's just, you just have to recognize that the most important thing is finding a local club that you like, and the people like you, and you can work with them, because everyone needs good coaches, good people, good human beings, and almost everything in life. So that's something that you could, and I'll send information if you want on that in the future. So
please.
Yeah. So so I can, maybe I'll play this. I'll play this real quick, see if it comes up here. Hopefully it does.
I think 1958 World Cup is a good stopping point. We can do a second one.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because I enjoy this. I need to, this is like a good wine. I need to ask questions.
Think about it. No, that's fine. I really appreciate that you want to sort of do it that way. So what I can do here, let me play this real quick and see hopefully this comes up. And then this will be just for like, I don't know, like it's 1 minute here, I think, or like 8 seconds. It's very little. So you can see this goal here. Hopefully it'll show. And then, what we can do, the next one is to get, and like I told you originally, I don't mind doing a series of this.
Yeah.
And now, Kelly, number 10, always the master and the
So
scorer
I'll
of
play
goal
this
number
again.
3.
Let me play this again here real quick.
Yeah, I know Lundgren scored first goal. And I think Didi and
now what's Pele number 10? Always the master and the scorer of goal number.
So, the things he did, and for those of you that, and I would encourage you to go just look at, just because these, like the time frames, just start looking online for different film that's out there, and then you can start to see some of the players. And it's just really, it's almost like watching Olympic stuff, really, in some way. So it's there's a purity to it. So I think that's one thing that I really like about that older era.
I just want to say something about the Soviet players.
Yeah,
because I know a little bit about that.
Sure.
There was a player that played on Soviet team. His last name is Voronin,
Mm-hmm.
which actually translates to the American as a crow.
That's
so
funny.
This is how he used to prepare for the matches. So he gets a call at home, and the mother would say he's not home. The trainer was sent for him. He's in the bar drinking with 2 girls, hanging out. Before the match, they're dragging him to the match. He scores 5 goals. He was playing for Spartak Moscow.
Yeah.
After being drunk, and I don't understand that. That's how players used to be.
Well, yeah, I mean, people were, I'll be honest with you. One thing that was very important about the Brazilian team, and I do think it's an important thing about understanding them, was because of the impact of the 1950 loss, the players took it very seriously when it came to their readiness, like not being crazy and wild, being drunks, being chaotic, and also this was another aspect about Brazil. Its professional league was still not fully developed, right? It really this World Cup sort of is what really helped develop the Brazilian domestic league into sort of a powerful league, right? Now, it existed, but it wasn't a powerful league where people wanted to come from all over to play. And so after this World Cup, it really changed everything, because people understood that this team was special, right? It had an incredible amount of talent. As was said earlier, it wasn't just Pele, right? I mean, there was really 8 legends on this team, right? It was, if any of you like basketball, I think the best analogy is it was like the 1990s Chicago Bulls. I mean, it was just a superpower. It wasn't just one player.
On racism, when Muhammad Ali won 1960 Rome Olympics, he came to New York and he went to a restaurant and he ordered a food from an upscale place, and they said, "I'm sorry, we don't serve African Americans here." And he said, "I'm not eating one."
That's a great line. Ali had the greatest lines in history.
Was there any racism here as well?
No, Ali, I love Ali because he just has the greatest lines ever. So one thing I think that was very fortunate for 58 was the fact that it was held in Sweden, and Sweden had really developed some of the first what you would call modern progressive legal systems when it came to things like marriage, when it came to so if any of you remember, or at least remember watching movies, but so Sammy Davis Jr. married a famous Swedish model, and Sammy Davis Jr., A, is very short, and B, he's African American, and and he couldn't get married here in the United States, but he got married in Sweden. And so I think Sweden was very important for two reasons. One is that it did not have, it just didn't have that same history that other places did or all over the world. Number two, they really sort of respected the greatness of Brazil and sort of how creative, almost artistic it was, how much class they had, just how nice they were. I mean, it's just everything. They were, so the Swedes really embraced them. And to this day, you'll see, if you go to Sweden, you'll still see people who wear Brazilian. I mean, they love Brazilian football going back 60 years now because of that relationship. So I think that's a huge advantage that Brazil had, is that it was played in Sweden. Whereas if let's be honest, if it was played in Italy,
Forget about it.
It just would not have been very good. And we'll get into sort of what happened later when basically, that's what Italy did. Italy looked to basically physically destroy Brazilian players. And we'll get into that in a future presentation. And that changed the modern history of football after what the Italians did. And it wasn't they tried to do it, they injured. One of the reasons I believe Pele's, if not the greatest player, is that he withstood, just like Ali, he withstood an enormous physical assault over his career. I mean, it wasn't just World Cups. That was really secondary. The Brazilian league, people tried to take him out. I mean, it was just, he was so physically enduring for 23 years. I mean, it's just amazing. 24 years that he played, 27 when you count going all the way back to playing professionally at 15. So, and he only got injured like 3 times, really, which is just insane, really. But anyways, we'll get into that in a future one. So hopefully, let me ask you this: was this fun or was this good? Did you guys like
No, it's good, and I like it, the open format that we can discuss and give.
Sure.
Hopefully, we'll get more people, because I kept postponing it. That's why.
Yeah. No, I understand. Yeah.
But usually we have good 20 people or so.
Yeah. And then what we could do is when you set up the next one, put the link of this one into the meetup.
Sure.
And then people who want to watch it can watch that too if they didn't get it. And then I'll add links in there because I have some other, all YouTube kind of simple little videos and stuff that people can watch. And so hopefully you guys like this. I mean, it was a
the thing is that I love this stuff and I could talk for hours.
Yeah.
History of soccer is the most important. It's more
I agree.
You are teaching in this event things that I never imagined. So it's very good to learn from you, because
oh, thank you. It means a lot, because someone who, I mean, you really it's a DNA thing, right? It's like I have good friends from that I work with over the years from India, and cricket is just it's just like it oozes out of the DNA, and there's just a magic to that. And you've, as someone who's Brazilian, you have that. You can't buy that, right? You can't rent it. You can't read a book on it. It's baked into your childhood and all the things you did. And so I always feel very honored to be around people who can really, who have that background, and it's, it's exciting. So no, thank you.
What I was amazed when I was in Brazil, I'm sorry, I had to stop.
Yeah.
I was in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. People stop everything when a soccer stops.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So I've been to, I will say this, I've been to big football matches. I grew up in Southern California, and in '94, I went to the World Cup, the Rose Bowl. And, but I will say this, because I've been to India a bunch of times when I worked at a big IT company, Cognizant, for 15 years. And I will say this, I went to IPL matches, which is the Indian Premier League for cricket. And it's like the greatest thing I've ever seen. I mean, the scale, it's like, it's biblical, right? I mean, it's wild. I mean, it's a Super Bowl. There's a Super Bowl every week. And it's something that, you know, as big as I've seen football matches, I've never seen I've been to a Super Bowl here. So it's a Super Bowl, and there's something really wild about it. And I was very fortunate. So at Cognizant, one of our big offices was in Pune. So I went to see the famous player, Chris Gale, and you know, from the West Indies, and he played for Pune, and I got to see, and it was like it was Michael Jordan. I mean, that's what it was. I mean, it was incredible. So I've been fortunate to see, you know, these incredible sports, you know, around the world that mean, you know, that play in a space that's enormous, right? That you know, basketball, I love basketball, but it does have a constraint in that it's a stadium that is, you know, 10 to 20, maybe 25,000. It's loud, but there's that constraint that when you are in these big field sports, there's just something, it's almost prehistoric, right? There's something prehistoric about them that just brings out a certain, you know, something deep inside of us.
Right.
That's
why I hated the World Cup in Russia. I was there for many matches in Russia,
yeah.
And the stadiums were half, you know, empty, because people either were protesting against Ukraine,
yeah,
or they were not interested in the matches because they were not advertised properly.
Yeah.
There was no structure. I mean, who the hell wants to go to Saransk?
Yeah.
I mean, there was only one airport, one plane landing in like one day.
Yeah. So I mean, no, so what would be fun is in you know, we can, you know, take ourselves up to, you know, I don't care, I'll do 3 parts of this or 5, I don't care. We can take ourselves up to the 70s, because I do think once you get into the 60s and 70s, it's just football is incredible, right? I mean, it's really like boxing in the way boxing was in the 60s and 70s. Football was very much like the same thing. It's just these superstar personalities, these incredible, you know, these were almost like you had during the imperial era of politics. This was like imperial level football, right? Where these were just collisions of national identity that you had all over the world. And it was really, you know, there's something about that that's incredibly, you know, unique. I mean, you have it today, but it's very commercial today, and it's very sort of integrated how commercial it is, right? So